We'll go ahead and jump right in. It's a real honor to be with you, and thank you for coming out on a summer evening. And I really want to encourage you. I'm not going to take a full hour, so we'll have plenty of time for Q&A, for discussion. But I'm very, very honored to be here, and thank you, Pastor Chad, and the whole team for letting me be a part of this. If you heard the brief introduction, I've had the honor and delight of being educated in the epicenters that call into question I thought. University of California, Santa Cruz, I'm a proud banana slug graduate 3 times. And then when I tell people in certain circles that I did my theological studies in Berkeley, they raise an eyebrow or two. But I had wonderful teachers, wonderful education, and exposure to every worldview you can imagine. So I want to express gratitude to these institutions, to the professors that nurtured me, but also and to the churches and families that nurtured me along the way. But why I mention that is when we even have a title like The Future of Socialism, we want to take a moment and actually know what we're speaking about. Because when you say the word socialism, it can be everything from the formative thought of Karl Marx in the mid-19th century all the way to a monastic community in Arkansas. In other words, socialism takes on a lot of different faces. So when we look at this, and by the way, there's a handout if you want to follow along, take some notes, please take advantage of that. We are in a moment of global politics and trying to understand the meaning of the term socialism. And so what I want to avoid is caricature. Now we have tragedies like North Korea, Venezuela. And these tragedies, or these experiments in a certain kind of socialism, have caused millions of people to not even want to speak the word. Then we have experiments in Scandinavia and Europe that don't seem quite as tragic, that have dimension to them that are different. And so we're going to look at the origins of all of those, and I'm going to do a little bit of history with you before we talk about what the future might be, because I want us to really get our arms around the socialisms. We have a gradual progressive change in the Democratic Party in the United States of America. This is not a pejorative term, it's simply a descriptive of the fact that since 1972, one of our political parties has been moving in a more progressive and semi-socialist direction, as the other party has moved in a more conservative or libertarian direction. And so we have polarization in the U.S. political scene. Anybody aware that things get really hot and interesting very quickly? And so we have these things, these become words that so quickly polarize. We have words like populism, libertarian. And then I think a better term for tonight would be to talk about the future of socialisms as we'll get to it. But underneath the word socialism, there is a deep suspicion and even hatred of the word capitalism. The people Vladimir Lenin in the Soviet Union called the useful idiots of the West that funded his revolution, the people who are happy to increase governmental control when they already have their money, that's one group of socialists. And then you have people who are very poor, watching others exploit them for wealth. You have another kind of socialist. So we're going to examine the roots of all of that and try to begin to march forward with an understanding that I hope is new and fresh to you. So a couple of just lenses to sort of look at as we go forward. I'm told I had to push this a couple of times, so there we go. But really, for thousands of years in general, but for hundreds of years in the West, we have been alternating between individualism and collectivism, these two impulses that are part of the human story. Those of you who are acquainted with a little bit of Western philosophy may have heard of the French philosopher René Descartes, or the Cartesian revolution. Alas, his profound thinking gets reduced to his "I think, therefore I am" statement. Anybody heard that? And Pepe Le Pew modified it, "I stink, therefore I am," etc. Descartes was much more profound than a simple sentence. He was after an understanding of the certainty of human knowledge. And what he became aware of is that he's a self-referential thinker. He was aware that he was thinking. He could not doubt that he was reflecting. And it's called a revolution because it gives rise to an even more powerful individuality or individualism that marks a lot of Western and now global culture. By the way, Descartes wasn't operating out of a vacuum. We have religious and secular texts going back thousands of years reflecting on similar things, but nonetheless, it's a revolution of the individual. Then in the 19th century, we have the rise of strong forms of collectivism. And they come in a variety of forms, from the Luddites who were resisting the Industrial Revolution to the Owenites Roberts Owens, who wanted workers in Britain to get a fair shake, an education, decent housing, to the work of Marx and Engels, which we will spend time on tonight, looking at a collective vision of what it means to be human. So the collectivist impulse, the impulse behind socialism, begins cooperatively but usually ends coercively. Let me say that again. The inclination towards socialism begins cooperatively. Let's all be in this for one another. But it often ends in coercion. And underneath it are the issues of power and decision-making behind people's futures. So where did this come from? And I'm just going to take a few minutes because the title was The Future of Socialism, but I'm a historian, and therefore we're going to go back to the future and look at the roots that bring today's fruits into being and prepare the way for what's coming. So in the classical era of Greek philosophy, we have this Raphael painting of the School of Athens with Plato pointing up to the ideals in the sky and Aristotle pointing to the concrete realities on the ground. But Plato and Aristotle were not only rivals in some of their ideas philosophically, they also had real differences about the active versus the contemplative life. See, the issues of socialism go all the way back to, is it the individual, what does it mean for the individual to flourish? And what does it mean to be part of the common good? What does it mean to be a person of commerce and work and labor versus a person who can spend their time philosophizing? Well, if you read Plato's Republic, anybody at least heard of it? Okay. And we all hear about the cave, and we hear about a few of the illustrations. But if you actually read it, Plato is an early collectivist, deeply suspicious of overemphasis on nuclear family ties, deeply embedded in the idea of the elite classes making sure that the common folks do their work well so the elite classes can philosophize. Aristotle is more the activist and is the source of more concrete thinking of the goodness of labor and the goodness of work. For Plato, people are assigned, according to ability, and especially, both Plato and Aristotle to some extent, but Plato especially, according to both family, ability, station, you're assigned different things in life. Aristotle gives rise to a bit more social mobility based on ability and opportunity. But the collectivist impulse, we find this totalitarian expression in Sparta. Now, I know that most of us have a popularized view of the Spartans holding out against the empire. Anybody know what I'm talking about? The 300. But they came from one of the nastiest societies that you don't ever want to replicate. You were a child owned by the collective from the time of your birth, trained to fit in your place in that society. So we have these impulses, individual, collective, all the way back in what we would call classical, even secular society. Now, we also have some of these impulses in religious life as well. So in the Christian tradition, by the 3rd century and especially the 4th century, individuals and groups began to gather in what we call monastic communities. What started out as fleeing the secular world soon became a gathering of devout religious individuals who began to bring good to the world. So we go from personal escape to community experience. And we want to give credit here in 529 to Saint Benedict and the rise of the Benedictine order and the Benedictine rule of life. He said for someone to be healthy in the religious calling, they need to not only pray, but they need to work. And the Benedictines actually created sustainable communities and begin to spread the hospitality and hospitals and caregiving all across Europe. But this religious communitarian life was understood as being different from life out there. Out there in the world where the vast majority of people at that time, 4th, 5th, 6th century, spent their time on the land as laborers tied to that land. But that was the secular work versus the sacred work. As a Christian, it's one of the best and worst moments in history. Positively, we get some amazing scholarship, we get some interesting economics, we get some fascinating examples of theology and spirituality, but we also create a huge gulf between the religious calling and the calling of everyone else. And so this is part of the impulse as well. Now, by the way, one of the things that happens all through church history for 1,000 years is these monastic communities actually end up doing so well economically, they're corrupted by wealth and power, and then they have to go through another reform. And so you have this problem of how do we intersect with money and wealth? What's the relationship of the individual and the community with money and wealth? Well, let me fast forward here just for time's sake. We also have a whole variety of utopian experiments all through history, not just religious communities. We have religious examples. In fact, one of the most interesting that you should enjoy looking up sometime is a man named Bartolomeo de las Casas, who in the 16th century spent more than half of his life battling against slavery in Latin America and in the Caribbean. He was once part of the Catholic elite, once himself even connected with slavery, and he had a second conversion away from that, and he battled for half a century for the dignity of the Amerindian as well as African people that he was interacting with. And so he actually created a community. Just before he died, he created an experimental community of cooperation with former slaves, with what we call Amerindian or Native American folks and Europeans to work together to cooperate, generate income, sustain their community. Didn't last very long. It was a brief experiment. But he's an example of that kind of impulse, as well as an example of social justice. The real problem with a variety of these experiments is they work in a very small scale, but they still require some kind of connection to the outside, some kind of connection to the larger local and global economy. In the 19th century in America, there were all kinds of utopian communities that arose. Anybody have Oneida silverware or cookware? Well, the Oneida community was not Christian or religious. John Noyes and his gang got together and they realized if we're going to be sustainable, we've got to produce something that will keep our community sustainable. But this was a community of free love and experimentation in the 19th century on American soil. A variety of utopian socialists experimented with this. Even the early Mormons were a form of this kind of community, of somehow combining commerce, cooperation, individual work. So there's a variety of groups in the 19th century that emerge, in all centuries that emerge as socialistic communities. From the 12th and 13th century to the current day, we've had the rise of free markets and the growth of individual liberties. And one of the things that I want to just correct the historical record or add to the historical record, much as I admire the Reformations and the Protestant work ethic that emerged in the 16th century, there were predecessors in the 13th, 14th, and 15th century in the universities of Europe These predecessors were talking about property rights, free trade, listen to these words, natural pricing, and not having the government interfere with the economy. Anybody heard those kinds of words recently? Well, they were being spoken at the universities rising up in Europe at the time. And then other Christian traditions caught on to that. One of the most famous is the School of Salamanca. And on your right, on that screen, you see the visage, the image of Francisco de Vitoria. And he's the first of the moral theologians. I want you to take a note of this. Economics, which is at the root of what socialism is going to address, economics is a moral science from the medieval period to 1900. I want to pause there. In the history of philosophy, in the intellectual history, west, east, north, and south, economics is a moral science. Now, it includes empirical data, but our idea that it's only about the facts and the figures, it's only about scarcity and abundance and certain empirical data, that's true, but it starts out as a moral science. The university in Salamanca, Vittoria argued that the just price is the price that has been arrived at by common agreement among producers and consumers, not by central planning. That's my addition, by the way, sorry. A price is set by the interplay of supply and demand. That's a just price. So it is with international trade. Governments should not interfere with the prices and relations established between traders across borders. And he spoke to these issues of trade that were now becoming global in the 16th century. He also wanted people to see interest rates as a moral issue. Just as an aside, John Calvin of Genevan fame negotiated with the bankers in Geneva a fair interest rate. They wanted 10%, he wanted 5%. They arrived at 6 7/8%. And by the way, that wasn't for your mortgage, that was for business, for the working poor. It's fair that people get a return on risk. It's also fair that you not exploit those who need to get to work. These thoughts were part of the moral theology of both Catholic and Protestant thinkers. What's usury versus reasonable interest? What's fair and right and just? So I always like sharing this because the prices of goods and services are an outcome of the actions of the entrepreneurs, the traders, the individuals producing the goods, the circumstances, and depending on the value that individuals place on goods. So prices are not fixed by nature or determined by the cost of production. They're the result of the common estimation of human beings. So these foundational notions that people need to be free to trade, to exchange, these foundational notions antedate the rise of what we call modern capitalism or industrialization. They go way back hundreds of years, and people have been thinking about them. Now, the Protestant work ethic itself is rooted in the idea that all good work is a gift from God. And I'd like to have you tonight write down 2 definitions that will guide our discussion as we chat together in a few minutes. I want to give you a definition of work, and I want to give you a definition of the economy. This will be really important, and everybody relax. We're getting to the future of socialism, I promise. But it's so important because most of this history is lost in the mists of time to most people who are getting all excited about free things the government should be offering. Okay? First definition, work. Work is all moral and meaningful activity apart from leisure and rest. Work. All moral and meaningful activity apart from leisure and rest. Parenting, volunteering, running a business, teaching, nursing, laboring, leading. Now, by the way, that work is unfortunately affected by human selfishness and depravity. I'm not idealizing the fact that we don't have problems at work, but work in and of itself, it's a moral and meaningful activity. Second word is the word economy. An economy, local or global, and we're all part of both now, an economy is a moral and social system of exchange. It includes property and wealth and contracts. It includes a lot of detail. But fundamentally, economics is exchange. And it requires at least verbal, handshake, written. It requires some form of moral and social agreement to work, doesn't it? I'm in a lot of airports. And I'm privileged to be able to be in places and encourage and serve other leaders. But when I'm in an airport, I'm always amazed at the choreography of how we treat flying today compared to when I was a kid. When I was a kid, flying was this rare thing you did once or twice before you became an adult. Everything else was maybe bus, more likely the back of the station wagon, okay? But think about the choreography from the bottle of water you buy, to the tickets you get, to the planes just the choreography of all that it takes and the element of trust it takes to run an airport. Economies run on trust. That's why when we have economic problems, there are not only objective factors, sometimes natural disasters, sometimes supply and demand, but often economics breaks down because trust breaks down. Exchange breaks down, the way in which people do it. So with those kinds of definitions in mind, it's really interesting to look at the different religious communities' reactions to work and to money. All through Christian history, there's been a deep suspicion of wealth, and yet the people with the deepest suspicion depend upon it the most. Think about it. Priests, monastics, missionaries, they're doing God's work, they're doing non-profit work, they're doing work that's sacrificial for eternity. But in order to do that work, somebody had to go out and make something, produce something, exchange something in order that the work can go on. And every tradition, by the way, not just Christian tradition, every global tradition has this unfortunate separation between the sacred and the secular. And I'm not talking about how one views God and the deep reverence God deserves. I'm speaking about the fact that what you do on Monday morning is important. And what you do, if you're a Christian, what you might do on the weekend, on a Saturday or a Sunday, very important. But what you do on Monday. And so every time we start healing this, we keep reinventing these hierarchies, these divisions. And part of why socialism is so attractive is because it appeals to our compassionate nature, not to leave anyone out and not to have anybody feel excluded, and to make sure nobody gets too wealthy because we wouldn't want them to be greedy robber barons, except the ones that give to our charity. And so, by the way, this tension isn't going to go away. But it's one we have to face. And I just want to thank all of you for the productive work you do in every category that you do it, seen and unseen. So let me jump forward now. We have market economies, the Industrial Revolution beginning to emerge in the 18th and 19th century. One of the most famous philosophers of economics is Adam Smith, who wrote his most important work, The Wealth of Nations, in 1776. Anybody heard of Adam Smith? Anybody heard of his phrase, the invisible hand? Well, let me tell you what the invisible hand was. Adam Smith wrote in favor of free trade and free markets, but 2/3 of his book is moral philosophy. And the invisible hand isn't the magic of the market. The invisible hand is the utter necessity of human virtue if the economy is going to work. Economics can only be free if people keep their word. It can only be free if people do their work. And so, interestingly enough, the American Revolution, yes, it was the no taxation without representation, yes, benign neglect on the part of England, all kinds of reasons for it, but one of the most compelling was economic. The British wanted to control trade, and the colonists did not want that trade controlled. I'm not reducing it to economics, but it's a part of it. So Smith and other thinkers begin to say the conditions under which people flourish have to include property rights, freedom of conscience. They have to include the importance of natural law and legislation that reflects natural law, and open access to markets. And as Smith was writing, and for the next 120 years, the Industrial Revolution, for all of its dislocations and problems and degradations, lifted millions out of poverty and provided the foundation for one of the most amazing stories in human history. And that is the story of the last 60 years. I'm about to get to Karl Marx as sort of the anti-story. But I don't know if you're aware of this, but in the last 60 years, more than 2 billion people have been lifted out of poverty because of global trade. Not foreign aid. Not central planning. I'll get to that toward the end. $1 trillion of aid to Africa have done almost nothing. A few billion in micro-lending are changing the entire landscape. Now, I've already given the gig up here. I am suspicious of large-scale socialism. But I'm not going to caricature it. Let's go to the source. And now we have to go ahead and take a look for a few minutes, as I push the wrong buttons here, at the specter of Karl Marx. This is his 200th birthday year. We should be having large laments and be wearing black over this man. There might be a 3 or 4% of his writings that touch the heart in terms of the condition of industrial workers, in terms of the oppression of some of the aristocracies and the bourgeoisie. There's some genuine compassion somewhere buried there. But Marx's own work, we really need to get this. And I want to just share a couple things. First of all, Marx is a new anthropology, a completely different view of the human person than anything found in any other global religion, and especially in his utter rejection of Judaism and Christianity. Marx was a Hegelian determinist, but he took out Hegel's existing spirituality and replaced it with pure materialist economics. All of life is reducible to that which is determinist, materialist, secularist, utopian. In other words, to be human is to work, and the goal is to create a society where everything is equally shared. Both the ownership and the production and the outcomes are equal. Now, at first glance, it's sort of a secular millennial. It's sort of a secular heaven. Except, Marx also said, in order to achieve this, we have to get rid of things like the nuclear family, private property, and especially small farmers and shopkeepers. He hated England. England had too many shopkeepers and too many small farmers. By the way, the people he hated the most were the Methodists, because they talked about ethical enterprise. You see, evangelical Christianity in the 18th and 19th century, before the tragic splits over race and slavery, was both an advocate of enterprise and social justice in the same breath. Getting rid of slavery, educating the poor, making sure prisons were reformed, making sure that children didn't work in factories 12 hours a day, and work hard and enjoy the fruit of your labor. So when Marx and Engels said that religion is the opiate, that's been overused as well, but what they meant was that the religious vision of a better future is keeping people content in their present and allowing them to go along with a system that needs to be overturned. Something else about Marx that one needs to know is that he actually in his writing says terrorism and violence are justified to achieve this end. And in the 1848 revolutions, in the 1860s uprisings, and to the very end of his life, he advocated action that would awaken a new consciousness. But he knew that both agriculture and industry had to industrialize, had to get larger, had to get more unfair in order for the revolution to happen. And so he saw it as being a gradual revolution over maybe a century. Well, that was his vision. In fact, the British historian E.F. Hobsbawm, who I endured as an undergraduate and graduate, who's written about these things, was asked in 1986, if we've been able to get to Marx's ideal, is it worth 20 million dead? And without a hesitation, he said, absolutely, many more. So the collectivist impulse of Marx leads us to Lenin, Stalin, and Mao's transformation of Marx. They decided to end the determinism and gradualism with revolutionary action. And so in communism, I'm going to use the word communism as opposed to the different socialisms. In communism, the party is the vanguard, the revolutionary group that will help usher in this new age by tearing down the old structures and beginning to build the new ones. The only problem is, every time it's been done, they've never quite gotten past the tearing down and been able to build something sustainable. And in fact, it's cost 100 million lives. With Lenin, it was revolutionary action, but he needed Western financing to gain power. With Stalin, it was the cult of personality. And along with Hitler, he's the exemplar of totalitarianism, collectivization, and destruction. With Mao and his Cultural Revolution, and his disciples like Pol Pot in Cambodia and Shining Path in Peru, you have a combination of indoctrination, re-education, and a refusal to engage in anything resembling reasonable economics. And in the case of China, 30 million dead to show for it. As Paul Johnson puts it, these totalitarians experimented with 1/3 of mankind. And we have the 20th century. But what about Euro-socialism? Decided to give you some good Scandinavian images here. Okay, so communism in its radical forms is a failure, but what about socialism in Scandinavia? What about parts of the EU? When you have well-educated, homogeneous populations with access to global markets and material success, a certain amount of socialism is possible because you have the material wealth to do it, and you can hire the labor to sustain it. Centralized governance functions vary country to country. And so different experiments since World War II in various forms of socialism are all turning out to be unsustainable in the long run. By the way, would you like to know one reason they're unsustainable? It's because Europe's not even replacing its own population. Because the wealthier people become, the fewer children they have, and they're not even replacing themselves. You add to that the breakdown of the biological family system, and you have to keep importing labor, and then if you import the labor that doesn't share your values, you've got another problem. And so the now, by the way, I'm not talking about government function. I'm talking about the experiments in greater central planning. So my argument here would be this. Socialism as defined by the federal government or the national government taking on certain functions works or doesn't work in particular circumstances. That kind of socialism will be around as long as humankind's around, because we're going to be debating and arguing what functions the government should take on in any free society. By the way, I always love it when people say, get government off my back, and then they are happy to take their student loans, or, in other words, governments only take on what the governed consent for them to take on in a democratic society. The problem is when they cease to be a democratic society, and they can't reverse the bureaucratic states that they've become. So, let's move forward to the 2016 USA election. Why are the words democratic socialist or democratic socialism attractive? Well, let me share with you why socialism keeps being attractive. First of all, it is compassionate. Socialism appeals to our sense of compassion and fairness. Nobody should be left out. Everybody should have opportunity. Nobody should get too rich. Nobody should be too poor. There's this sense of fairness that it appeals to. It appears to have less self-interest involved because it's all for one for all, to each according to his ability, to each according to their needs, from each their ability to each their needs. It sounds so good. The problem is that it's economically unsustainable. So let me name you the 3 hot button issues that we're being agitated about and are again coming up, and they'll be coming up again for a long time. Free education, fair wage, and free health care. On the surface, all noble, all important. None of us would argue that if people work hard, they should have some opportunity. None of us would argue with that. None of us would argue theoretically that education should be available, and none of us should argue that people need health care. The problem is all of those things require the resources to be sustained. And the moment central planning starts taking over the economy begins to fail. Productivity goes down. In fact, for the last half century, every time the individual income taxes are reduced, tax revenues go up. More production, more taxes. Today, as I speak to you, we have the highest tax revenues in U.S. history. And the highest deficits, because we don't know how to balance our checkbook. By the way, if you and I did our checkbook the way our local, state, and federal governments do their checkbook, we'd all be in jail. Anyway, moving on. But I want to understand, socialism appeals to a sense of fairness. I'm not going to use buzzwords like entitlement. I'm not going to accuse a socialist of anything other than wanting the very best for others. The problem is that people aren't merely a collective, that people need both personal incentives as well as the common good in mind, and economics doesn't work according to central planning. Socialism can work, people argue, if it's just done well. The problem is it's been done well in pieces in Scandinavia. It's been done well in pieces in parts of Europe and even occasionally in parts of Latin America. But as a system of total control, it simply doesn't work. So what we need to do as we talk about the future is begin to talk about the fact, what are the conditions under which humans actually flourish? What do people need to flourish? Well, people are spiritual, emotional, physical, economic, social beings. People need access and opportunity. They need community. They need dignity. The conditions under which people flourish include reward for work well done and opportunity to better oneself. By the way, a little fact that you may not know. You all remember the year 1942. I know you woke up this morning thinking 1942. Stalin in Mother Russia, which he started using the word Mother Russia instead of the Soviet Union as they're fighting for their lives against the Nazi juggernaut. He allowed people to grow vegetables in private plots of land for the first time since the forced collectivization of all the kulak farms in the 20s and 30s, which, by the way, resulted in mass starvation, just as they did 30 years later in China. Food production in 1942 and 1943 in the Soviet Union reached 1914 levels, just giving people the chance to grow their own food. People need to think of others, but people are individuals. And the collectivist mindset does not have the regard for the individual and the creativity that the more free market mindset may have. The future of socialism. Well, let me jump forward here because I'm going to hit my time wall In spite of saying I'm not going to talk for an hour, I'm almost going to reach that. Okay. Let me tell you where the future's going. First of all, we have two major issues that relate to where socialism may go. One is anthropology. The more we question what it is to be human and the structures for human flourishing, the more we have an open door to totalitarianism or liberty, depending on where we take that. And by the way, that upcoming seminar is going to be so important on human sexuality. What does it mean to be a human being? What are the family and community conditions for people to flourish? It's an anthropological crisis that we're in right now. What does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be male and female? What does it mean to flourish as a person? The other that's going to relate to socialism is epistemology. What knowledge is valid? I'm going to just declare something to you. Not all opinions are equal. Not all statements are true. Well, I have a right to my opinion. You have a right to be wrong. Or at least debate where we might be on the spectrum. But we've lost critical thinking as a discipline. In the emotivism of both radical libertarian extremes or radical socialist extremes, we've lost critical thinking. This is part of the future. Or is it going to be critical thinking or subjective feelings? But I want to share with you another way forward. Before I share that, though, let me tell you where socialisms are going. We will always be debating the extent to which government should administrate or run things. That's never going away. So there will be forms of mild socialisms. There will be forms of collective activity, again, as long as we have human history. What I think is important to understand is the principle. I want to give you another big word to write down. The principle of subsidiarity. What functions belong to what person or group? Subsidiarity is this idea that you begin with the individual who is part of a family, who is part of a local community, religious or not religious, but is part of a local community, who's then part of a state, part of a nation. By the way, that identity can also include ethnicity, religion. There's different parts of that. But the individual is the starting point, the dignity of that individual. What's happened is what used to lie with the individual, the family, the church, the voluntary association, the local city, the local charity, or even the state, is now being looked at by the federal government. That's not just in the United States the last 100 years, that's also all through the world. Well, the government should do something about this. Folks, 150 years ago, people wouldn't have even had that thought. Somebody's poor, you help them. The church steps in, the synagogue steps in, the temple steps in, the family steps in. By the way, I'm not against the government stepping in, don't mishear me. So the future of socialism will be a continuous debate. What is the role of national, state, local? What's the role of public? What's the role of private? Number two, the future of socialism will also be a future of what we together want to pay for out of the fruit of our labor. It's so easy for someone who's built their log cabin to say, I'm an environmentalist, no more building here. It's so easy when you've made your money to then tell other people how their money should be spent. What do we want to expend limited resources on? Got some real challenges. You know, the free market offered this young child in Great Britain a chance to go to Italy for perhaps life-saving surgery. And the socialist system said no. The free market did that. But the socialist medical care of Great Britain said no, it's your duty to die in this bed. Now, before you shake your heads, we should shake our heads at that tragedy. But what do we or don't we pay for? What do we or don't we expect? And from whom do we expect it, and to whom do we pay it? Number three, about the future of socialism. As long as people feel that they are entitled, there will always be a place for forms of socialism. That somehow somebody else's success came at their expense. I have news for you economically. Wealth can be created. There is not... We had pizza tonight just before this meeting. And I want you to know something. There is not one pizza for 7 billion people. We can bake more pizzas. I want to give you another fact that you may find surprising. We have population problems in pockets of the world. Our problem with the world is not overpopulation. Our problem is all the injustices and violence and war and lack of opportunity and breakdown in systems. The problem isn't too many people. Because, by the way, once the economy begins to improve, the population stabilizes. More people with more access to more opportunity will bring population stability. Fascinating, isn't it? So counterintuitive. You see, the socialist mind is a mind of scarcity that has to be managed by a bureaucratic class. The entrepreneurial mind is a mind that says there is scarcity and it needs to be managed well, but there's also abundance yet to be discovered. And it's that abundance versus scarcity that's going to determine the future debate. But as long as folks feel that they are entitled to redistribute others' wealth in certain ways, there will always be socialisms of some kind. Now, by the way, before you think that I'm a libertarian in a radical sense, folks, I'm really glad for the roads I drove on today. I'm really glad for the hospitals that I go to. So I'm really glad for the public services that my money goes toward. But those debates will continue. But let me share with you, before I close, let me share with you another way forward. And that way forward is what I call the way of ethical enterprise, or what I would call liberty with the common good in mind. We need to protect individual rights, and we need to think about the common good and what that means. You see, the common good means equality of opportunity, but not always equality of outcome. Private and public should not be at odds with each other. They should be partnering together. And there should be partnerships between private enterprise and the public domains and the public leadership that needs to happen. There needs to be domain integration. That is, social services and education and government and business and religious communities and the arts and the media need to understand that they're all part of a flourishing community. And by the way, without economic engines, none of them exist. I'm an academic. I know that surprises you with all the detail you've gotten tonight. And I remember my professors, when I first started sharing about economic wisdom, my professor, that's capital. Capitalism is just so selfish. We need Christian socialism. We need socialism, not capitalism. And I said, okay, before you go too far down there, what building do you teach in? Well, that's the Smith building. What did Mr. Smith do? I don't know. He just gave money and we have a building. Mr. Smith went out and risked everything and built a business and employed hundreds of people and had enough left over to build the building you're teaching and telling people they shouldn't engage in what Mr. Smith did. Remember, totalitarian systems reward intellectual and bureaucratic classes. They reward the people who will fund their operations, but they punish the productive in the middle and the lower end who want to make a better life with less constraint. It's not the billionaire the socialist is worried about. It's my local mechanic in California. That $150 an hour labor charge, he doesn't take that home. By the time he's paid all his taxes and his rent and his salaries and his benefits, he's got enough to live. He's the one who refuses to be a socialist. But he's also the one whose tithe supports a church and whose charity supports the Little League team and whose extra money supports the arts. So the future has to include individual rights, common good, private-public partnership, domain integration, and it has to include risk and reward. Interestingly enough, anybody remember some little ship called the Mayflower that landed at Plymouth Rock? You might have heard of that. The first year they were together, it was awful conditions and people were starving. But the first year or so they were together, they did everything collectively and it was a disaster. The next year, they still did some things collectively, but everybody had their own land and they had more than enough. People are not made to be in isolation, but they're not made to be controlled. So in the end, socialisms will always be with us. Totalitarian ideologies will all be present, whether they're in the form of dictators in Venezuela or Cuba or North Korea, or whether they're Mayor Bloomberg telling us what soda we should buy. And he's got no problem as a wealthy beyond imagination person saying that the person buying the soda should pay more for that soda so they learn to change their lifestyle. That's a totalitarian way of thinking. And that's the impulse behind even the well-meaning aspects of socialism. But in the end, it comes down to the dignity of the human person. And the reason Marx is going to fail, and let me leave you with this word on the future. Marx will continue to fail because human beings are not machines. Human beings are not mere economics. Human beings are spiritual, emotional, relational, vocational beings who need to both be given the opportunity to flourish and the communities to serve. And they don't fit neatly into ethnic or economic or social blocks. The future of socialism, it's going to be there. But I think the future is going to be a richer and more complex one. So thank you very much for the first part. Let's go ahead and open the questions. Okay, I'll pull it up a little bit for us. By the way, did you like the artwork up here? That's Kathy's work. It's my wife's work, so in good free market fashion, take a look. Okay. Please.
Ooh.
Our marriage is a voluntary covenant. All right, jump in.
Excellent. I just want to point out, I found a mistake on your sheet here. The first link, it says action.org. It's actin.org.
Oh, thank you.
So I just want to point that out so you can get to that.
Microsoft Word is totalitarian.
There you go.
All right.
And then I'd also like to point you to the little cards in front of your seat. If you could fill out one of these Connect cards so we can send you an email when our next and upcoming events are. We'll be raffling at the end 2 T-shirts of these beautifully designed T-shirts by Pastor Chad back there. We'll be raffling off 2 of those. So if you could fill these out, we'll come and collect them at the end of the Q&A. So we have one excellent question on our on Pigeonhole. And it was actually a joke question, but I think you can pull something out of it. So I'm going to ask it. If Bernie Sanders is a true socialist, why does he own 3 houses? Seems like redistributing the wealth doesn't apply to him. What say you?
You know, I want to try to avoid caricature because I don't want to put a public servant down, and I don't want to. In fact, consistent with my own conviction, I don't want to dictate somebody's lifestyle, right? I'll only say this. Socialism honors the political class. What I call the intellectual bureaucratic class is what's honored by socialism. And all through the last 200 years of different experiments, the people who are the vanguard of the party or the party members or the bureaucratic classes always had a lifestyle way above the people that they were determined to serve. By the way, that goes for fascism as well, and I didn't have a chance, I should have mentioned it. Fascism is just another form of totalitarian socialism. Hitler had the best welfare state in Europe up until the last 4 months of World War II. By the way, at the expense of the rest of the world, right? So my answer to the Bernie Sanders conundrum or the Al Gore conundrum or name it. How did somebody go into the Senate 20 years ago worth $200,000 and emerge worth $15 million, dedicated to a life of public service? Well, wise investments, excellent opportunities. It's the nature. By the way, this is both parties, so please hear me on this. The reason I'm being so careful is I don't want our thoughtful voices being one more down with or one more negative. I'll say this. The political, intellectual, bureaucratic class feels that they need these resources or they deserve that for all the sacrifices that they're making for others. And so what happens is that's the justification. And it's interesting because you go to a place like Cuba, and doctors and street sweepers aren't very far apart. And at first glance, it's, well, that's fair. No, they're all really hungry. But party members, government members, certain military leaders, a few doctors, way up there. So this is the problem, the systemic problem with socialism. By the way, are there problems with free market, what we call capitalism? Huge ones. It's called the problem of human beings, but yes. But the difference is very, very stark.
Excellent. Thank you. Any questions out there?
So let's open it up, and you can, if you want to make a comment, we'll call it a question. Anyway, please jump up.
I have a lot of questions, but I'll just start with one. I've noticed that just within my own circle of friends over decades, that especially as a Christian, there's always that assumption, yeah, you're conservative, you're Republican. That seems to have changed, and as I've talked to more of my friends about that have gone more left-wing politically as Christians, and talking about economics and the politics of it, there seems to be a sense of justice that they bring to the table with that. It was like, yeah, but those evil rich people, they built their empire on the backs of slaves. They built their empire on the back, not all wealth is created, some is passed down. And that's what I've, started to pick up. I just define it as a sense of justice that seems to prevail itself in their thinking, which is understandable. So I'm just curious your thoughts on that issue of justice within kind of everything that you've spoken about, and is that a legitimate?
You've got a real, by the way, I love your word justice here. By the way, let me give you a little phrase that will really help you in debate and conversation. Justice is social. The word social justice is frankly a redundancy. But joking aside, this plea for justice is a deeply biblical one. And the way the Bible defines it, it's a social, relational, moral, economic issue. But it's not defined by everyone with the same outcome to their labor. It's defined by fairness, opportunity, compassion, and the ability to help someone when life doesn't treat them well, and the ability to celebrate when it does. So, and I want to say this very carefully, the Bible is neither libertarian nor socialist. Take care of your own plot and help us build the wall, Nehemiah says. In evangelical Christianity, I won't speak for all of it because we don't have time, the first 100 years of evangelical Christianity, if you want dates, be 1730s to the 1830s, there was a seamlessness between personal and social ethics. So if you were a revitalized believer, you wanted to make the world a better place. Interestingly, it wasn't the destruction of private property or the ending of liberty. It was the proper ethical treatment of people and caring about the dignity of the human person. In fact, William Wilberforce, the famous English the one who got rid of slavery in the slave trade, also had 70 other social initiatives. Prisons, education. He and Wesley wanted to get rid of distilled spirits and replace it with Guinness. And don't tell anybody I'm promoting Guinness, okay? But the point was they cared about life. But they also knew that the human person had to have liberty. And that liberty meant that life may not be fair sometimes, but we'll be there compassionately to take care of you. The big difference, the friends of yours sort of, and I want to use this not pejoratively, the friends of yours moving left, what they're moving away from is rapaciousness, self-centeredness, what they see as greed, and toward compassion and fairness and opportunity. But what they need is a more nuanced understanding of both the human person and economics, because what you don't want is simply, because by the way, you distribute wealth equally, you can do that for 1 year and you won't have any wealth left. Because the human person needs incentives and opportunity, and you've now put a kibosh on that. So, and by the way, let me give you one other narrower history. Since 1968, American evangelical Christianity, and this is broad, has been divided between left and right. And not necessarily on issues like abortion or marriage. In some cases, left and right agree that we should protect children and we should protect the aged and we should protect marriage. But they've been divided over the role of government, over economics, over military issues. Those divisions won't go away completely, but it still comes back down to the dignity of the human person and what makes a person flourish. So we've had, starting in the 1830s, we separated social and personal ethics over race and slavery. That's the great divide that we're still healing. The idea that you could somehow go to a revival meeting and then go own slaves. In 1757, Wesley said, no Methodist can own a slave. And then by 1857, we have Southern Methodist University. So you've got a problem there. And we're watching some similar things now, which is why I think voices of wisdom are needed.
No, thank you. That's a good point to go back to history. Because it seems sometimes they are kind of jumping the Christian ship.
Yeah.
In light of it, because the Christianity gets mixed into politics and all that, so they're actually jumping ship in that. So it's kind of to say no, it's something that can be corrected within Christian.
There's a wonderful book out by Scheiman called An Atheist Looks at Religion. And he said every single major social bit of progress almost always comes out of a religious impulse. So whether it's hospitals and hospices from the first century in the Didache saying you cannot expose your infants or procure abortions, to taking care of the aged and the infirm and the others, all of that comes out of religious impulses in contrast to the Greco-Roman society around it. Now, by the way, other religions have good impulses too, so I'm not going to make it uniquely Christian. But those religious impulses are there. Your second question or thought?
I'm just kind of curious to get your response on it within the context of what you spoke about. That is, I've also heard the argument about, especially in tax, where there's that kind of a collectivism within the early church, sharing everything. It says pretty plainly. Is that more in tune with kind of the EU, the example of socialism oriented pieces that it's a collective community, they're all kind of the same, they're under persecution, so there's that brings into it. I was kind of curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Acts chapter 5 is a really difficult text when Ananias and Sapphira are struck down for lying about their contribution. Here's the key word that helps you understand all of the collectivism of Acts, which is beautiful. It's voluntary. Paul spends a good part of his lifetime, Paul the Apostle, evangelizing non-Jews and encouraging his new converts to financially say thank you to the Jewish friends who are starving. And he goes, the goal isn't that any one person would suffer, but when he said the goal is that there would be equality, he's not speaking in some empirical scientific term that everybody's going to be at the same place at the same. What he's speaking of is it's not fair that you've received all the benefits, spiritually and otherwise, that came from your faith, and these folks are really desperate. Hey, let's even this up here. So the key word is voluntarism. This is what Tocqueville in his Democracy in America was so surprised by. He was, as a good French bureaucrat, he was kind of alarmed at the kind of Wild West free enterprise. But he goes, Americans keep joining all these voluntary organizations. They keep helping each other. And when politics is local, I tell people, don't wait for the State House or the White House. We can change the Fillmore right now. With a few business people and a few social service people and the religious community, we can change the Fillmore right now, no matter what they might do at the State House or the White House. So I think the key word is voluntary. Yep, thank you.
Thanks very much. Appreciate it. The question that I kind of thought about as you were talking was talking about conversion as a driver for kind of like good economic policy. And do you think that I guess reinvigoration of interest in socialism has come with a decline in virtue, and where has that kind of new anthropology that you talked about infected us as a society, as a culture, as the West?
You know, I think it's paradoxical. I think you're in this. I want to repeat your insight so we really hear it. A decline in certain virtues leads to what I'm going to call a decline in certain virtues leads to a certain kind of anarchy, small or large scale, which in turn invites the totalitarian impulse because people want order. So if we have family breakdown, now we're serving breakfast and lunch at local schools. Now don't get mad. I'm not against lunch programs. Okay, there's no against here. It's that, you know, how hard is it to get a bowl of oatmeal? And if it's really hard, we've got a real problem, okay? So the point is the decline of one kind of virtue leads to the totalitarian impulse. On the other side, the rise of caring for my neighbor can also lead, at least in a preliminary way, to an initially socialist impulse. Well, I'm going to do whatever I can to help my neighbor. Boy, we need to do this as a whole. What you are voluntarily divesting yourself of, do you want to put into a political class to then make it compulsory? G.K. Chesterton, the British journalist and great Christian apologist, was a redistributionist. He actually wanted more government engagement in redistributing income. I love some of his great moral plays. I love some of his great thinking, but he missed it economically in terms of what actually leads to prosperity for people. But I think your first insight is really accurate. Back to subsidiarity. If I'm personally responsible for my decisions, if I'm responsible within my purview for my family, if I'm a part of a local community, if those are the first places and where my expectations lie, that's different than saying I'm owed. Now, I'm going to be very, very careful here. We have, just in my lifetime, allowed millions of citizens to vote since 64, 65, Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act, which also means those same millions have only in my lifetime begun to have access to education, economic opportunity, overcome the systemic issues. So I want to say this carefully. We have to deal with individual iniquity and institutional injustice at the same time. We have to call for responsibility. But if I go to some communities and say, you need to be more responsible, I'll be shouted down not because I'm wrong, but because they see the larger systemic issue as being more serious. And this is where back to the whole left-right, the right sees the individual issues sometimes pretty accurately. Mom, Dad, take care of business here. I'm using these illustratively. The left sees the systemic issues sometimes pretty accurately. This is a weighted system. This isn't fair. I think the Christian answer is not to be captive to either right or left, but back to the book of Proverbs to talk about a just scale and right balances and the combination of the common good and, by the way, get up and get to work. So how we get there, that's what you and I get to teach.
Yeah, and I guess kind of with that question, that's an interesting one because for me, the idea of systemic change happens as a number of individuals. You know, there becomes an individual critical mass in a community or in a culture, in a society, where now those systemic injustices can eventually fade away. So it's on the level of the individual as a part of a collective. Right. But it seems the other side of that is a collectivist kind of what's, you talk about Marx with the radical violence that it takes to manufacture that kind of change.
quickly. That seems to be the impulse on the left side of the aisle. Let's radically, through coercive means or through force, change this, or through like a revolutionary group of people.
Well, this is what happened in Italy. By the way, anybody heard of World War I? That little conflict that destroyed Europe and was the end of Christendom? Okay. By the way, I still every day wish that the 500,000 soldiers that left the trenches during Christmas had just kept walking. Not come back. But after World War I, all of Europe went to the right or to the left, and in the end, the totalitarian impulse has the similar results. A few people benefit. A large number of people might get mobilized and get fed, and watch this, they'll give up liberty for the lunch pail, temporarily. But both on the right, Poland, Germany, Italy, Romania, Hungary, other places like that. On the left, areas of France, the Spanish Civil War, other kinds of things. That totalitarian impulse takes over when there's a vacuum. And the vacuum of World War I has now come to the shores of the U.S. And that's a vacuum when we separate personal and social ethics. And so, since the 1830s, various traditions of the church have struggled with that. We've either made social ethics the sum total of Christianity, or we've made individual spirituality the sum total. And what I think is the opportunity we have is to not separate the two anymore. Obviously the priority lies in the subsidiary truth of the individual, but the moment, for instance, in our own ecclesiology, the moment you're a converted Christian, you're part of this global and local family, right? You have obligations as well as opportunities. And so I see a stitching back together of what we've kept separate. But we've struggled with that for a long time.
So to summarize, it's like the individual good and ethic that radiates out into the community.
Yes. Well, but also it evaluates institutions. It's not that the church as institution has to be coercive, but the church's members called to those institutions can be influential. Absolutely. Someone else want to jump in?
So I've been a pastor for 20 years.
Thank you.
Thank you. So it seems like every election year that there's a whole church and state, the separation.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of people that have opinions. We're talking about just the ethical, and we're talking about Christianity. We're talking about where does the church play? How does the church speak into this without it getting crazy? It's like it's like with your friends where like they're even in the church there's a split between.
Oh yeah.
So where what's an accurate role of a pastor in all of this politically?
Let me tell a parable and then give you four things that I hope will help, probably confirming things you've thought, but hopefully encouraging. This is a parable, a real life parable in Portland, Oregon. My friend A.J. Swoboda, and you'll appreciate this combination, he's a Pentecostal eco-theologian. So he's an environmental activist, a Pentecostal pastor, brilliant expert on the Sabbath, just a wonderful gentleman. The heads of both local parties serve communion together at his church. The number one thing we can do as a church is provide space for people to encounter God together, the God of Scripture, the God of history that we proclaim. I'm not trying to, by the way, that sounds so pat, but it's so important. When you're experiencing God's presence together and the shared virtues that flow from that, that's the starting point. Secondly, there is no restriction on political speech for any religious leader except direct party or personal endorsement. And even that's questionable. But the second thing we need to do is find our courage again to speak less to the politician and party and more to the issue itself and the issue under the issue. Thirdly, So I would say a combination of experience, courage. The third thing that pastors can do is get more familiar with economics, more familiar, not with ideology, but with the empirical realities of how things work. Because God has two books. The Bible is beautiful about economics. It gives us a lot of great wisdom and insight from the design of creation to the destiny of humankind, which, by the way, we will be working in bodies forever. Everybody relax. It won't be sweaty and frustrating. But we will be embodied people working. That's what it is to be human. The disaster of sin that brings the injustice and the structural and personal iniquity, and then the deliverance of Jesus Christ. So pastors and leaders, fellow believers, if you have influence over one other person, you need to bring the whole story of Scripture to bear and bring it to bear on economic life. Work is not the result of the fall. Before sin, God designed a world in which our work mattered. And after the Lord Jesus returns, we will be working. That's really important because most people see work instrumentally. I have to do this in order to do the important stuff, rather than inherently important to what God's doing. The fourth thing we can do, I want to come back to your politics. The fourth thing we can do is really work on this distinction. There is a difference between moral and ethical are almost interchangeable. Those of you who love philosophy, so if I use them interchangeably, understand I know the slight nuances. There's a difference between the moral underpinnings that we must affirm if we're going to confess our faith and live in this world, and policy applications. So real Christians can differ over policy applications all the way to certain socialisms. So Christians can differ on single-payer health care. By the way, I think it's a moral obligation that our society make sure people have medical care. I also happen to think it ought to be administrated locally. The market should be in. See where I'm going? So I can have the same moral conviction as a more socialist sister or brother and not divide the church. Maybe there's a fifth thing. I feel like a Hebrew poet. 4, yea, 5 things, shall I declare. The fifth thing is we need to create spaces like this. And I'd love to come back and talk through the hottest button issues you want to talk through and demonstrate the ability to roll up our sleeves and come up with contextualized solutions as opposed to decontextualized Facebook chatter where we just sling insults and we sling labels. I call it labeling and libeling. So I think those are the first 4 or 5 things I think we can start with. But boy, pastors, leaders, take a look at the sources that I gave you, please, on this page. Get acquainted with the good work being done in ethical economics, and you'll be miles ahead in serving others. I think we have time for one more. Yep. Anybody else like to chime in?
Thank you, sir.
Glad you're here.
Pleasure. You mentioned the impact of not growing populations in Europe having the economic impact.
Yeah.
My first part of the question would be, how do you think abortion has contributed to that over the last 30 years, 40 years? And do you think, I think one of our fathers said, we can't live without morality and religion in this system that they were setting up. Do you think the problems with capitalism and free enterprise are moral and because of greed and things like that, and so we're looking less appealing to more and more people?
First of all, thank you for bringing up what scholar Peter Kreeft calls the 2 most fundamental issues of our day, which is choice and life. Yes, I think the dehumanization, both of life in the womb, vulnerable life outside the womb, life at the end of life, the dehumanization behind it, and the destruction of the biological family as the normal place in which, and by the way, thank God for all the exceptions and all the redemptive work of the church and such, so I'm not being a determinist, but you hit a fundamental issue that the people who are living are aware that they have peers who are not. And so this choice has been placed over life. Okay? So that is a fundamental issue, both of population demographics. You know, we're missing 55 million people in America, 60 million people in America. Last 50 years, we're missing. Now, some of those may have been really bad actors, but a whole bunch of them would have contributed things that we can't even imagine. The other part of this, though, is as prosperity grows without the religious impulse, the transcendent impulse, then material well-being becomes an end in itself, so therefore we're going to have one child, maybe two. Now, by the way, some people, they don't have a choice on that. Some people can make that choice. I'm not restricting choice, but the consequence of a prosperity without principle underneath it leads to that kind of thing. So I think it's an important issue that you brought up. The second half of what you're sharing, go ahead and repeat it again so we hear it clearly. So you asked about abortion, then you asked about greed and capitalism, the lack of morality.
It's either James Adams or Washington who said something like, this republic cannot stand without the pillars of religion and morality.
Well, actually, all of our founders, regardless of religious persuasion, and by the way, just in case you wondered, there was one atheist, 4 or 5 deists, and most others part of general communions, and every spectrum of passionate to secretive about their religion. But all of them said morality and reverence before the Almighty. And here's why. Underneath legislation is prior moral principle, and those moral principles have to be permanent. They can't be up for grabs. Let me give you an example that's not theoretical. I worked hard in California for Proposition 8. Twice we won on the issue of marriage. I never once quoted the Bible. I never once imposed religion. I actually affirmed domestic partnerships, civil unions, private rights, the ability to visit in the hospital, the ability to receive funds. I mean, I said no one of any lifestyle should be deprived of all the rights of other citizens. But I said this, anthropologically, biologically, sociologically, this is the first time in history that the human race is now making equal a relationship that does not produce the next generation. Never, unprecedented. And I said to a legislator, I said, I may lose this battle, I won't be a bad guy, but don't make me affirm that I'm supposed to agree with the choices of others. And this legislator, and they're doing it again in California, well, we'll give you a religious exemption. And here's the biggest change in my lifetime. I said, sir, the government does not bestow rights, it protects them. And this is the difference in political philosophy between John Locke and Thomas Hobbes. When you read Hobbes' Leviathan, you need a very powerful sovereign and powerful central government to control the animalistic impulses of people. Now, John Locke may be a little bit too idealistic, but he said, no, the natural state of humankind tends toward liberty. And the government's job is to protect that to the greatest extent. What's changed in my lifetime is we now think the government bestows those rights, the same way they gave you money back with your tax return. You understand? Now, please, but don't hear this, though, as libertarian or socialist. Hear this as a way we look at anthropology. So thank you so much. Appreciate it.